Working Girls by Maureen Carter. Read by Barber. Prologue. The one streetlight that had been working had just gone out. "You and me both," Shell muttered, words lost in a wide-mouthed yawn. She hadn't had a punter for 2 hours, and it was so cold she couldn't feel her toes. 4 creased and grimy tenors were lining the soles of her shoes. It was all she had to hide for opening her legs to 2 blokes she didn't want to see again, let alone screw. She couldn't go back with a puny £40. Her feet wouldn't touch. Charlie had told her he wanted a monkey by Sunday, and he wasn't someone you dared cross. A flash motor turned the corner, cruised towards her. She was no good with car names, but even Shell knew a BMW when she saw one. For a second she panicked, then told herself not to be stupid. They weren't all pimpmobiles. Loads of normal blokes drove Beamers. The car was almost at the curb now. She took a calming breath, then another. She'd have this last John, then knock it on the head for the night. She licked her lips, hoped they weren't blue. Her white ankle-length coat was unbuttoned, her fists thrust deep in the pockets. She pulled it open even further as she approached the car. Long blonde hair fell across her face as she leaned forward to look inside. The practiced smile froze on her face. It couldn't be. Why hadn't she listened to Vicky? "Get in." It wasn't a request. Shell put her hand to her heart, scared its pounding would crack a rib. Her glance was everywhere but on the driver. She was looking for an exit, knowing there was no way out. Flight or fight. Either way, she was fucked. She sighed, opened the door, sliding across the seat. It was warm inside, and apart from her body's odour, she smelt rich leather and classy aftershave. They drove in a silence she didn't dare break. They moved away from the back streets now, heading for the ring road, joining other traffic. There was a tall tower, all steel and glass, to Shell's left. On top was a readout in neon red. It flickered every few seconds, flashing through time, temperature, date. Shell followed it with her eyes. 2019, 4 degrees centigrade. She had to crane her neck. 13th. "It's Friday, innit?" He responded without looking. "So?" "Unlucky for some, innit?" she whispered. Chapter 1. Michelle Lucas, 15, throat wounds, dead 9 hours approx. Detective Sergeant Beverly Morris couldn't keep the anger out of her voice, so she was saying as little as possible. She watched her boss, Bill Byford, check his watch, aware that her body language more than compensated for the verbal shortcomings. Her arms were clamped around her body, a Doc Marten foot tapping the rock-hard earth, her normally fluent features fixed in a stony stare. It was a little after 8:30 a.m. She'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, alerted by the school caretaker who'd found the body. He was now under sedation. Michelle Lucas had been left to bleed to death on the edge of a scummy pool on one of the coldest nights of the year. It was yet another image that Bev would have to learn to live with. "You all right, Bev? What do you think?" She turned her face to Byford. In itself, the question wasn't insolent. Its delivery was definitely borderline, and judging by the look the detective superintendent was returning, she might have just overstepped the mark. It wouldn't do to get on the man's wrong side. Supportive senior officers were like snowmen in the desert. She gave a half smile to break the ice, and cracked it further with a full apology. "That was out of order. Sorry, Gov." She was relieved to see a softening of his features, but it didn't alter the harsh reality of the violence before them. 15, you say?" Bev heard the doubt in Byford's voice. She wasn't surprised. The victim appeared older, the long blonde hair, the on-the-pull clothes barely concealing the womanly curves. Bev's initial estimate had been late teens, early 20s even. "Some kids grow up fast, sir." She watched as he edged closer. They were in a dip, and the body, screened by shrubs, wouldn't have been visible from the footpath. She flinched as she saw Byford recoil. She didn't blame him. Any decent man would. The girl's long legs were splayed and stained. The tacky, crotchless knickers, more shocking than her near-nakedness. There was dried blood and excrement on the inside of her thighs, the stink of human waste in every sense. Bev averted her eyes, not out of embarrassment or disgust, but in respect for the girl's shattered dignity. "Animals," she hissed. "What did you say?" "Nothing." Aware he was still watching, she tried focusing on routine procedure rather than what appeared to be random savagery. She turned the pages of her notebook, but the tremor in her hands did little to calm her thoughts. "Come on, Bev, what is it?" She glanced at this big man, who always had an eye for the small detail. But how could she tell Byford what was wrong when she could hardly explain it to herself? All she knew was that in 8 years on the force, nothing had hit her so hard as the senseless obscenity of this young girl's death. And she'd seen worse, far worse. She'd cracked sick gags at murder scenes along with the rest of them. It was a defense mechanism, essential for survival, but it was more than that. It was part of the culture. Fit in or fuck off. Bev had no intention of looking weak. "No prob, Gov," she answered softly. She knew his nod of acknowledgement was as convincing as her words of assurance, but they were all she had at the moment. She broke eye contact, glanced down at the notes of her brief interview with the caretaker. Byford resumed his scrutiny of the scene. She waited in silence, knowing he wouldn't want to talk until he'd absorbed the details, the camera in his brain snapping a series of pin-sharp stills. She'd worked with him for nearly 3 years, was familiar with his ways, followed most of them. He was 52, but she reckoned he'd only started to look it in the last 18 months or so. The black hair was greying, but there was still plenty of it. Bit more of him, too, she realised. She hadn't noticed the slight paunch before. Mind, at 6'2", he was hardly Michelin Man. Even if she could see his face, it wouldn't tell her what he was thinking. She wondered anyway. His kids were grown up, but he was still a father. "Parents?" he asked. Her eyes widened. If he was into clairvoyancy, she'd soon be out of a job. As to Michelle's lineage, the words Bev had in mind were 4-lettered and not the kind you'd use in front of Granny. She gave a snort instead. A Morris special. He lifted an eyebrow. "Do go on." She noted the sarcasm. Not like Byford, that. He must be picking up bad habits. "Mother and Father of the Year award?" she asked. "Missed it by a whisker." She consulted her notes again. According to the caretaker, a bloke called Jack Goddard, Michelle was in care. She was taken in when she was about 12. She paused, recalling the tears on Goddard's leathery cheeks. He didn't recognize her at first. "Hardly surprising," said Byford. She glanced round at the sound of a car door being slammed. She hoped it was the scene of Crime Boys, or they'd be getting it in the neck from Byford. Even more than that, she hoped it wasn't Mike Powell. "Anyway," she continued, "Michelle was in year 10. Goddard says she was a nice kid, had a heart of gold, do anything for anyone." She was pretty good at interpreting Byford's eyebrows. At the moment, they were in his hairline. "There must be hundreds of kids at the school. How come he knows so much about Michelle Lucas?" "Everyone knows Michelle," said Bev. "She was the original Home Alone kid. Only her ma didn't just take off on holiday. She took off, period. The story...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?